Welcome to Saints and Sources. My name is John Brown. Today is the episode I've been most excited to do, probably since we started this project, and that is the question of if polygamy uh, causes a rise in a righteous generation. The justification is always that the reason it can be done is because it's commanded, which we've talked about in other episodes, and then the whole reason to do it was to raise a righteous seed. Um, and that was always really interesting to me as I was going through this process, because especially when I was on my mission, polygamy would be brought up, and I would talk about three traditions that I understood that, come to find out, are not super accurate. The first tradition is that polygamy was essentially a requirement. They were out in the middle of nowhere, and because of persecution and Hans Mill massacre and Missouri persecutions and everything, that there was more women in the church than men, and so polygamy was just needed for to have families and to like physically care for these people. We'll talk later about why that's not true. The second was that polygamy wasn't intended for everybody. It was targeted. You had to be called to do it. It was very specific, and you had to be ready. You had to be able to do it. And although there is some truth in that, the broader truth is that polygamy was intended to be part of the Abrahamic covenant and a requirement for exaltation and salvation. Um, and then the third thing was that, hey, whether you like it or dislike it, or it puts a little yucky taste in your mouth, it resulted in more and righteous children being born. And that's going to be the big one we go into. It's important to remember that today I want to explore the historical and scriptural evidences to see what we know and what might be tradition. With that being said, the content is specifically made for people who believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ, the restoration of the priesthood, from Joseph Smith to Brigham Young to our prophets today. And for people that polygamy is one of those teachings or doctrine that's on their shelf of things that are confusing or troubling or hard to reconcile. Um, we carefully examine the history, those traditions and teachings, but we do not criticize or condemn people for making decisions that we disagree with or that we know now um, might not have been the best option. We're no Monday morning quarterbacks here at Saints and Sources. So let's get right into it. The first one, let's talk about demographics. Um, the idea that there was ever a period of time in Utah or the area known as Deseret that there was more women than men is just factually not accurate. The census in 1860 showed that there was 22% more, and that was kind of the height of polygamy, that there was 22% more men than women. And we'll talk later that this was something that was known by leaders of the church, and that they accepted that this lost boys generation, this men that were unable to marry, and because of polygamy, um, was a regrettable but acceptable outcome, right? Some returned missionaries wrote in letters that it was difficult to marry because leading brethren had secured the most eligible sisters. The historian Catherine Danes, in the book More Wives Than One in 2001, found that in Manti, the younger and poorer men often delayed marriage or were never able to be married because the established older men already had multiple wives. And George D. Smith, in the book Nauvoo Polygamy, 2008, cites correspondence with young men in Utah who lamented being unable to find wives due to the disproportion caused by polygamy, or I would say exacerbated by polygamy. It was already going to be a rough shot anyway because of that 22%. But if some of the men are having 2, 3, 5, 10 wives, that's only going to make it worse. We don't know for sure how many men left Utah in search of better marital prospects, but we know it wasn't zero, right? So number two, we've talked about this a lot in others, but I think it's important to underline here that polygamy, the understanding that polygamy was a requirement for exaltation, was repeatedly and constantly taught. And quotes here from Brigham Young, 1866: "The only men who become gods, even the sons of God, are those who enter into polygamy. Others attain a glory and may even be permitted to come into the presence of the Father and the Son, but they cannot reign as kings in glory. Another a quote from 1855. Now, if any of you will deny the plurality of wives and continue to do so, I promise you that you will be damned. If you will not enter into it, you will not enter into the fullness of the glory of God's kingdom, right? If you're not a polygamist, you are damned. That's not a one-off. That's repeatedly here in the description. As always, here at Saints and Sources, we love our sources, and you'll find that in the video description. And the last quote of the probably thousands is that the law of plural marriage is one of the most important doctrines ever revealed to men, and without it, man cannot attain to the fullness of exaltation in the eternal world. So that's that second one. So the third one we talked about, that polygamy resulted in righteous generations. Brigham Young specifically said, this is the reason for the doctrine of plurality of wives was revealed, that the noble spirits which are waiting for tabernacles might be brought forth. In other videos, we've talked that my understanding is that Brigham Young used, I would call like an immature science at the time, combined with his understanding of polygamy found in the Bible, to come to the conclusion that, because the understanding at the time was that righteousness or goodness, hard work was almost all nature, very little nurture. That the righteousness of a person would be passed genetically down to their kids. That's a fair assumption for him to have in the 1860s, but it's definitely something we know today, completely not accurate. The classic family, isn't it about time? That time, love, attention, development, those are all infinitely more important to a person's spiritual development than the genetics of their parents. So there was some research done, and I'll pull up the quote here. Researchers at Indiana University Bloomington in 2011 published a study, and the conclusion, the punchline of it was, simply put, the more sister wives a Mormon woman had, the fewer children she was likely to produce. Although it's great in terms of number of children for successful males to have harems, the data show that for every new woman added to the male's household, the number each wife produced go down by one child or so on average. Other research compiled by D. Michael Quinn, I'll put the quote up here, but the punchline of it is, on average, the women studied, polygamous women had 5.9 women child per 5.9 children per woman, but for monogamous women in that same time in the same area had 8 children per woman. Even initially, the monogamous woman with one spouse, hopefully a loving, capable, wonderful man, is having more children. Anecdotally, we even see that in church leaders. Brigham Young had 56 wives. He only had children with about 16 of them, but those 16 women had 57. No, I think he had 57 wives with 57 kids. You correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. But essentially, for every child-producing woman, Brigham Young had 3.5 kids per child-producing woman, which is not a way I like to measure things, but frequently it's pointed to, Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, they had 56, 57 kids. But really, when you boil down to it, if those women had just had a single relationship, it would have resulted in a lot more kids. I think when I did the math, it was like 150 more kids or something like that than the 57 that were born. So I think this is where the truth claims of this really start to fall apart. So I created a little super basic math where we compare two kind of parallel universes. One parallel universe where all members of the church practice polygamy, and another where no members of the church practice polygamy, using that same math that the historians have compiled. So with that, you can see here, that we're making a couple assumptions. I started with 70,000 people. That was the approximate number of the church when Brigham Young, uh, his last year of being prophet. We're assuming a perfect 50-50 male ratio. That's not going to be accurate. We're assuming 100% marriage rates and 100% child survival rates. The reason I'm assuming that is because in both parallel worlds, those rates should be more or less the same. But when the three things we're going to marry, or the three things we're going to measure, is going to be uh, births to polygamous women, seen here in blue, births to monogamous women, seen here in yellow, and then the lost boys that we see here in red. And just for clarity, I did it one generation is every 25 years. So the children born to the generation in 1850, it would result in approximately 200,000 births, but 60,000 of those would end up being lost boys. Um, the average polygamous relationship had 2.4 wives per male, and that's where that number comes from. So, but in that same generation on the parallel Earth, um, 2,000 or 280,000 births. I would say that's fairly close, but as it progresses, I'm just going to go to the last generation. That generation would have essentially 1.8 million births from polygamous relationships, minus 524,000 lost boys. That is crippling. Just the idea of that number of men needing to be forced out of the community or live in celibacy is just really sad. But it is staggering when you compare that to the 4.5 million births that would have happened. This is uh, almost triple the number of members of the church that would be born. Plus, on top of that, we wouldn't be kicking out half of all the boys born. And so let's talk about this lost boy problem. This is obviously something that we see in fundamentalist sects today, that the members of the church, of the fundamentalist groups, every year, for you to have polygamy, you have to get rid of some men, right? And this is a big problem for them. But it was also a problem for our church. So here are four quotes. There's a ton others, but these are the four quotes that I really want to go talk about. One from Brigham Young: "It is the duty of righteous men to take more wives, that a righteous seed may be raised up." Again, he's kind of connecting a righteous person to having righteous children kind of inherently. I think it's fair to assume that a righteous person will be able to teach their kids, but even God had a third of his kids be rebellious. So I think it's clear, and we can put to bed that theory that genetic righteousness is a thing at all. But to continue, "And the man who has proven himself unworthy of this blessing must be content to remain single or to have only one wife." This is 1866. In 1855, Brigham Young says, "There is not a sufficient number of females in the territory for each man to have a wife in the order of if the order of monogamy prevailed. But the order under the order of plurality, some men will have many wives, while others will have none. This is according to the wisdom of God, who will equalize and regulate all things." And one small tangent on this: this is particularly a problem because the way righteousness was essentially being judged at the time was obviously by people's choices and actions and things, but also their calling and their priesthood rank, essentially. And this, you can tell that apostles and prophets and church leaders, their sons didn't have this lost boy problem because they were more known to other church leaders. This is something we see in the military a lot, that you promote the people you're familiar with. And so if you're not hanging out with, or if you're not interacting with certain subordinates, then they won't get promoted, not because they're not capable, but because when a hard thing came up, you went with the person you were most familiar with, right? A glaring thing: a lot of these apostles, their sons, like, were ordained as apostles extremely young. Now, I'm not saying they're not worthy, right? But Brigham Young Jr., he was ordained as apostle at age 11, right? And he very well could be worthy. I'm not questioning that. Um, John Taylor, similar situation with his son, who was ordained at 26, I believe. Joseph F. Smith, the son of Hiram and the stepson of Heber C. Kimball, he was kicked out of school, got called on a mission in his early teens, got called as an apostle at age 24. Now, these men obviously grew into that ability, right? But I think it's fair to point out that if this is a problem, but not a problem for you and for your kids, it might not be something that the leaders address, right? We do the same thing. Um, I know my wife, she's a trained physical therapist, and when she joined a group, she was working part-time because we were still having kids. And there's this, and they were wonderful men, right? These were not bad people. But in this situation, she took 3 months off for maternity leave, and a lot of their pay was because of bonuses. And they essentially said, "Hey, you missed 3 months of work, but you're going to miss 6 months of bonus." And it took her like days to convince these guys that, hey, if I miss 3 months of work, I should miss 3 months of bonuses. I should not miss 6 months of bonuses. And these were not stupid men. They were intelligent. They were not bad men. They were wonderful. But my point is, if your problems are not being expressed at the table, there's a possibility that they'll be diminished for the leadership in charge. And I think this lost boys problem is a clear example of that, where Brigham Young says, "Hey, some of you guys aren't going to have kids," but it's very clear and very evident. Or sorry, some of you lost boys will never get married and never have kids, but this is not a problem for any people in their circle. Not that they didn't care, but it might not have been as pressing. So, um, more quotes. Heber C. Kimball. He says, "Do you suppose that all men are going to have wives? That is not so. Many of them will never have wives and will remain single all their days if they are not worthy of a wife, for the Lord is not going to suffer his daughters to be imposed on." And again, I think I'd point out the Jacob 2, where it talks about how polygamy is really hard and causes heartbreak and tears of the daughters of God. I think it's more of an imposition to be forced to do or to have polygamy be a requirement than it would be to have monogamy be a requirement. Last one, there's a great disproportion in the sexes in this territory, and men will be obliged to remain single unless they are willing to enter into the law of God and practice the plurality of wives. The Lord will provide for those who obey him. So here it's saying you can have polygamous wives or you can have no wives. You choose. So that is kind of talking about raising righteous generation. The math just doesn't show. Not only did it not happen, but it's almost impossible for polygamy to cause a righteous generation. Now, I think it's fair to say, hey, we have a lot of amazing church leaders that ended up coming from polygamous marriages. I'm a result of polygamous marriage, and I'm pretty awesome. Um, but I want to, is this a correlation or is this a causation? I think those people would be able to develop into spiritual giants regardless of if if their parents were polygamous or not. I mean, we have wonderful church leaders today, and all of them are results of monogamous relationships. So that was kind of talking about the church as a whole. Now, I really want to get into Brigham Young, or to Joseph Smith, because this is where the rubber meets the road for me personally, right? If raising up a righteous generation and having lots of kids is the justification behind polygamy, not only do we not see that with Lehi, Adam, Noah, things like that, but we don't see this at all with Joseph Smith. Researchers, so I don't want to get this wrong. A geneticist named Hugo A. Perigo um, did a lot of DNA analysis, and they have not been able to find any, in fact, most were completely ruled out, any children of between Joseph and one of his polygamous wives. Researchers like Brian Hales, Todd Compton, Richard Bushman have the range of wives that had a for sure, or what they understand to be for sure sexual relationship with Joseph Smith between 12 and 14, right? So I did a little bit of more nerd math, right? And there's for every year a couple is married and not actively trying to prevent pregnancy, you have a 15% chance of not getting pregnant, right? Um, with when you take this list of 14 names and you calculate how many years they were married, it comes out to being 23 marriage years. This is kind of similar to work hours or man hours that between mostly 1841, 1842, and his death in 1844, he was married for 23 marriage years, man years. And the possibility of him having 0 children with these 14 women over 23 marriage years is not just low, it is preposterously low. It is insanely low. How low is it? It is about 100 quintillionth of a percent. 100 quintillionth of a percent. To put that in perspective, it is 100 times more likely that you win 2 lotteries than it is that to have no children over 23 marriage years. It is more likely to be struck by lightning 4 times in your life than for this to happen. And so the question, well, actually, we'll circle back to this in a little bit. Another problem with this whole raise up a righteous generation is about 14 of these women, also same researchers, Brian Hales, Todd Compton, Richard Bushman, show that about 14 of these women were already pregnant or married or had kids with other men when they were sealed, right? Most of the time, they refer to these as like non-sexuals, like time or eternity only, which kind of opens up its own kind of things. If they're already married and they already have kids, why are you breaking up this family so you can have an eternal polygamous spouse? That's a huge question. There's no spiritual logical answer that I've found for that question. Um, so that's kind of the other thing. But going back to the 100 quintillionth, let me say it again. Yeah, 100 quintillionth of a percent chance of having 0 children over these 24 marriage years is some people will say, well, they weren't, they were sexual, but they weren't regularly sexual. They were doing things to prevent pregnancy and all these things. But to my point to that is, what is the point of polygamy if you're marrying these people, having a sexual relationship with these people, but preventing pregnancy? This makes that is the most, I don't want to insult or name, I'm not here for that, but that seems real conspiracy, kind of flat earth level thing that, oh yeah, because it makes sense if you said, I don't believe in the church, I don't believe in the truth claims of the church, I believe Joseph Smith was a polygamist, I believe he was having these sexual relationships and he was trying to prevent pregnancies, maybe even doing abortions, because these kind of carnal things. I don't believe that's true. I don't believe that's true for Brigham Young. I definitely don't believe that's true for Joseph Smith. But for you to be a believing member of the church and to say he had a sexual relationship with 14 women over 23 marriage years, but went out of his way not to have children, that is bananas. That is crazy to me. There's no answer to that. If polygamy is to raise a righteous generation, I think the math has shown not only did it not happen for the church as a whole, but it is impossible for it to have happened with Joseph Smith. If Joseph Smith was actively practicing polygamy, there would be a child, right? And even if you said, well, maybe one of them died or other things, because plenty of people said that, this daughter is Lyons. I can't remember her full name. Lyons said that this daughter was a daughter with Joseph Smith. Not only is that not true, that statement she must have known, right? She was either having sex with both of them at the same time and she wasn't sure, or she was only having sex with her husband and um, but believed for whatever personal reasons that her daughter would have a better life being the daughter of Joseph Smith than not. So anyway, kind of fun math time over. This brings us to my last final questions about polygamy and raising up a righteous generation. And I've said it before, I'll say it again. If Smith was trying not to have kids, then what is the point of polygamy? What are we doing here, guys? The second question, historical records show that some men had more kids, Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball. But the church as a whole had less kids. It made missionary work much harder to do. And I would argue that alone hampers missionary work today. So did it really help raise seed? I think the historical evidence shows categorically it did not. And the claim some make that, oh, it made better, more righteous seeds or children. I really don't like calling children seed, but I can see that argument that these people, you go to Utah, you risk everything walking there on hand carts and everything, and then you're asked to do this gut-wrenching, difficult, hard thing, that the only people that would go through that have got to be true believers. I reluctantly see the argument to that, but I think that's a very weak argument because you're already a spiritual giant after going through all these things. And so it makes no spiritual sense, no doctrinal sense, no statistical sense that having these women go through these horrible, lonely, In Sacred Loneliness, that famous book, is too much to bear to have less children. And I think if polygamy truly made more righteous children, then we should be doing that today. But we don't, because it doesn't. Lastly, right? The last question, is this tradition of raising up a righteous generation from polygamy, is this something we can reconsider based on in a faithful, loving, forgiving, kind way? Or is this something that is a true and eternal principle, right? I think as we open our hearts and prayerfully study history, study the scriptures, we'll be able to get more answers. And I believe this will result in a greater understanding of revelation, of love, of eternal marriage, and everything. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed going through these because a lot of scriptural things you can kind of debate. Was Abraham commanded? Was he not Abraham commanded? I don't think there's strong evidence that he was. But these numbers, you really can't argue with these numbers. It caused less children to be born. It was extremely difficult on the women. It caused a generation of lost boys, or had the potential to cause, if it was practiced as it wanted to be, a huge generation of lost boys. And it made missionary work more difficult. So the argument, it's not there. And then the argument for Joseph Smith, again, 100 quintillionth of a percent chance that he would have 0 children with 14 of his polygamous wives. It strains credibility. Well, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful for me to go through. If you found this interesting, edifying, spiritually uplifting, if this helps you with the polygamy on your shelf understanding in a faith-positive, church-affirming way, please subscribe, follow. We're going to try to do videos approximately every week or two and get into these fascinating topics. But thanks so much for being here, and we'll see you next week.